Hello, everybody. Can you hear me? Well, don't answer that. Thumbs up. Yes, great. Thank you, Peyton. Appreciate that. I just want to thank all of you for joining us tonight. We are so excited to have you here for the Badie-Bosco Smackdown, virtual Smackdown. I want to thank our Alumni and Development Fellow, Mackenzie Snow, for putting this together and working with Badie and Bosco on this. It is so exciting, and this is my first time attending, so I can't wait. And without further ado, I'm going to hand this off to both of them. Enjoy.
Thank you.
Thank you, Megan and Mackenzie, for organizing this. We're really excited to be here. And when we got the guest list today, and I realized that it was basically a reunion with so many of our former students, we were really excited about it.
Yeah.
And then I thought, well, I hope that Bosco and I aged well, because it's been a few years.
Yeah.
Yeah. So just to kind of get us started, I want to say thank you to everybody also that is attending. This is the first time that we do this kind of alumni engagement, and we're just really excited to see all of your faces, or your names, right? If your faces are not present on the screen, that's also just fine. And so a couple things that I want to say. The first one is that since you're all graduated, let's dub this the Dina Rob Smackdown. So we can go on a first name basis. It doesn't have to be so formal. That's the first piece. The second one is that we know that you all paid to do this, and we're so appreciative of that. And just to give you a little bit of the background, when we were first emailed about the prospect of doing the Smackdown and having students pay for it, we thought, wow, like that, something about that just feels funny. Like, we know so many of these students, and we did it for them for free in these classes. And as soon as they said the money was going to go to ISD, we're like, all right, we'll sell our souls, no problem. All right. So I want to say thank you. This is a time of COVID, and we have no budgets. And so we really appreciate that you guys are here to support us. And we're really appreciative that we get to see you and that we get to engage with you. And with that, I guess we'll start with our topic. Are you ready, Rob?
Yeah, I'm ready.
Okay. So I also just want to say one more thing about questions that were submitted, which is to say that our plan is to kind of let those questions guide our conversation and guide our debate. There may be times where we're specifically calling out a question. We're not going to attribute it to anybody in particular in case you didn't want your name attached to it. But sometimes it'll just be kind of embedded in the discussion. Sometimes we will refer to them specifically. And at the very end, we'll also open up the chat function so that if anybody has any lingering questions or discussion points that they want to bring up, that we can address those as well. Okay. So the first thing that I want to do in terms of the substance of what we're going to be talking about is to tell you or to read to you the first sentence that we intentionally used in the International Studies Program's Statement of Solidarity. So as you know, many programs put out statements of solidarity. As you know, a group of faculty and staff put out another statement of solidarity. So there were a lot coming out of Centre College. And the International Studies faculty crafted language that was deliberately sort of targeting what's going on domestically and tying that to what's going on internationally. And so the first sentence that we decided to start with was, the International Studies faculty affirms that Black rights are human rights, okay? And so as international studies majors, many of you, maybe not all of you, but many of you are probably familiar with Hillary Clinton's visit to China, in which she said, women's rights are human rights. And the reason she did that was to make a statement about something that was seemingly so self-evident, but still not practiced. And we felt that it was important to do the same thing in talking about Black rights, that it is so self-evident that Black rights are human rights. And the fact that we have to say that explicitly and publicly in 2020 is really tragic. And so that's how we started our statement. If you'd like to read the rest of it, we now finally have social media because we have faculty that are younger than we are that know how to use social media well. And so we actually have an Instagram account. We actually have a Twitter account. It's not Rob and I that are manning it. but the full statement is on those accounts. So with that said, when we talk about human rights abuses, usually our focus is on other countries, right? So what's happening in Syria, or what's happening in Yemen, or what's happening in North Korea. And what we want to do today is sort of reposition ourselves so that we can think about human rights in a slightly different way. So we can think about what's happening in Syria and in Yemen and in North Korea, but also what's happening in the United States. There's this really famous photograph from the Tiananmen Square massacre in China from 1989. I'm sure many of you have seen this image of the tank and this man standing in front of a tank, right, who has never been identified. And it's sort of become this really powerful symbol of, resistance to this really aggressive authoritarian state, right? So who is the human rights abuser and who is the resistor to those human rights abuses? And what's really interesting is that in general, right, I mean, when we look out at the world, we think of countries like China being the tank, and countries like Russia being the tank, and countries like North Korea, right, or the government of Syria being the tank. And, the little guy that the tank is about to plow over, who he was not actually plowed over in reality, but in terms of that image, those are sort of the democratic countries that are trying to resist. And all of a sudden, we have to change our lens through which we're looking at human rights to think about the possibility that the United States is the tank, right? And there's a different set of resistors. And that's so important, and that's so important. And so we're gonna start our discussion today by talking about Black rights as human rights and talking about human rights regimes and addressing all of this through the lens of sort of treating states equally and assessing what's going on internally in those countries, not through that traditional lens of the US is, the poor resistor or the one that's defying the human rights abuses and these authoritarian countries being the tanks, but rather that everyone can be a tank, right? And anybody can be the individual resisting it. One more point that I want to make, and I'm going to turn it over to Bosco, which is that this idea of looking at Black rights in the United States, or in other words, human rights abuses against Black people in the United States, this is not a novel concept. This is something that dates way back. And so in 1947, the NAACP wrote a long report, a 96-page report that you can find online, that they wanted to submit to the United Nations. And this report, and the United Nations had just formed by that point, right? It's a very new organization after World War II. And in this report, they're documenting all of the human rights abuses that are going on in the United States against Black people in the form of Jim Crow laws, in the form of mass incarcerations and police brutality. And what they wanted to do was to submit this to this new organization that now has this Human Rights Council, or this Human Rights Commission. And it was a plea for help, right? Look at us in the United States. Our rights are being abused. We would like the United Nations to take up this issue. And to make a long story short, there was a lot of resistance in the United States government, as you can imagine. And a lot of that resistance came from the fact that there was fear that the Soviet Union was going to be able to capitalize on this rift in the United States, or capitalize on this idea that the US is not sort of this liberal and free and democratic society that it claims to be against the Soviet Union. And so they stifled all of the efforts of the NAACP to try to bring this to the UN. So ultimately they did bring it to the UN, but it was in sort of, this little ragged form, this tiny meeting that was not well attended, that was not well publicized. And the UN ultimately said to the NAACP, I'm sorry, like we just don't intervene in domestic matters. But that doesn't mean that there isn't a precedent then for trying to address issues inside of the United States as human rights issues using the UN or the Human Rights Commission or the human rights regime in general. And so That was a really long start. I'm going to turn it over to Rob at this point so that he can talk a little bit about a couple of examples of human rights treaties or conventions that we can think about when we're assessing human rights at home and abroad.
Thanks, Dina. Well, I thought one could pick any number of human rights treaties and conventions to talk about when we're talking about human rights at home and abroad. I thought I would just talk about a little bit about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and then the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. If you're on this call and you had me for international law, you probably remember the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, or the UDHR. But you may not remember the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. I cover that now. I didn't for a long time, but I cover that now. It's ironic that 1947 was the date of that NAACP report. The very next year is the year that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was adopted officially by the UN General Assembly in 1948. It's also ironic that Eleanor Roosevelt played a role in kind of resistance to looking inside at the United States and racial issues as human rights violations, considering that she's the one that said in her famous speech before the General Assembly that, human rights begins at home, in your own neighborhoods, in your own schools, in your own society. And if you can't do it there, you have no right to point the finger at anybody else. Well, anyway, everyone's heard of the UDHR, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It's not a treaty, it's a declaration. It has 30 articles, and these 30 articles are pretty straightforward. They're very easy to understand. They form the basis of all human rights law. If you read it, there's stuff in there about freedom from torture, cruel and inhuman treatment, the right to free speech, free association, equality before the law, and as well as things that most nations consider part of a person's ability to live a life of dignity and security. Basically, the right to Social Security, the right to gainful employment, the right to health, and the right to education. There's also this striking, I think it's very interesting phrase in there, the ability for the free development of the personality, the free development of the personality. You have the right to conditions that allow you the free development of your personality. Structural racism itself is a violation of that fundamental right. And the UDHR is important to talk about, I think, and not only in the context of what's going on now, particularly in the context of what's going on now, because many of the examples, for example, of police actions against African Americans and other minorities, but also against peaceful protesters, inhumane or degrading treatment or punishment, the excessive use of force, they're violations of the fundamental rights found in the UDHR. As well as other human rights treaties the US has signed and ratified, like the ICCPR. In fact, some of you may have seen that the UN Human Rights Council just issued a statement about this on the 17th of June, basically talking about the application of universal human rights to the situation of what's going on in the United States right now. So I think it's worth talking about the UDHR and considering that when we look at the protests, when we look at what's going on, I think it's worth thinking about the UDHR and how it applies to this situation. The second thing I wanted to talk about, I can answer more questions about the UDHR if you'd like, but the second treaty I'd like to talk about briefly is something that may not be as familiar to everyone. It's the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. This was formalized in the 60s, 1968, 1969. The United States didn't ratify this until 1994 in the Clinton administration. It's very widely ratified in the world. I think there's like 182, 183 states parties. In 1994, the Senate wrote a big report about it when the United States ratified it, talking about the United States having to use our position to lead the world in bringing an end to racial discrimination. And so if you read the treaty, The treaty condemns racial discrimination. It condemns phenomena such as slavery, apartheid, condemns racial propaganda. It calls on member states, federal governments, central governments to combat racial intolerance through education. You're supposed to make hate speech and hate crimes illegal. It clearly references in there things about what we would consider in today's parlance voter suppression, violations of your physical security. The United States, interestingly enough, we did ratify this, but we ratified this with some really interesting reservations. One of the important reservations that the United States put in to its ratification of this treaty was that we would not accept any limitation on the freedom of speech. This is kind of founded in this American, I guess, if you trace it back, this Enlightenment idea that the truth will kind of win out in the marketplace of ideas. And so that today, it can be traced, that today is related to why hate speech is not a crime in the United States, whereas it is a crime according to the convention. There's also tension over the very definition of discrimination. The United States tends to say in regard to the treaty, well, you know, we have the Civil Rights Act of 1964, whereas the UN committee that deals with the implementation and the monitoring of this particular treaty says that, yeah, well, you know, but the United States tends to define discrimination by intent. But if you read the treaty, it says very clearly in there what the treaty means by racial discrimination. Discrimination doesn't require proof of discriminatory intent. If the effect of a policy is disparate, then that counts as discrimination under the convention. So just to relate it to what's going on today immediately with the protests and what's in the news, we don't have the time to go through all the provisions of the Convention to Eliminate Racial Discrimination, but you know, things like failure to apprehend perpetrators for police violence, extrajudicial killing, that's all, those are all violations of the Convention to Eliminate Racial Discrimination. Interestingly enough, according to the treaty, it's a remarkable treaty if you read it, it's very wide-ranging. Interestingly enough, one of the clauses in there is pretty straightforward. The state is supposed to be educating and informing its citizens about racism, and it's supposed to be informing and supporting groups and organizations that work toward eliminating racism and working toward interracial understanding. That's in the treaty. So anyway, Dina will probably have something to say about the Eleanor Roosevelt piece, but that's just a little kind of overview of the UDHR and the International Convention to Eliminate Racial Discrimination. Does that work?
Yeah, I get to. So I can respond. Yeah, to the Eleanor Roosevelt piece, because the Eleanor Roosevelt piece is related to this petition that I mentioned earlier, that the NAACP had attempted to bring to the United Nations with what they hoped would be a lot of publicity, and ultimately was not. So Eleanor Roosevelt had said at the time of the drafting of the UN DHR that she was instrumental in, right? And really an important document with very noble goals. We can talk about the implementation in just a minute, but she was incredibly hostile to the NAACP's efforts. Even though she was on the board of it, she ultimately resigned from the board over this petition. And again, it was over fear that the Soviet Union was going to be able to exploit this and use this as fodder against the US. And so this idea of having to start closer to home on human rights, as Rob mentioned, I mean, she just didn't walk the walk on that. And ultimately, as I said, the NAACP got the meeting at the UN, but it was small and it was unpublicized. And they had extended an invitation to Eleanor Roosevelt, and she declined to attend. And so she didn't participate in that. So that's sort of, that's anecdotal, right? But what's important here, I think, or the point that I want to drive home is that the human rights frameworks that Rob is talking about are really powerful as norms, and really powerful as ideals. But if there is going to be any appetite, or if there is little appetite for actions closer to home, in the sense that countries need to be looking internally first before judging externally the actions of others on the issues of human rights, then the possibility of fulfilling the promise of human rights, the promise of fulfilling the stipulations that are outlined in the human rights regimes, the ones that Rob was talking about, as universal principles, is extremely unlikely. And in my view, the reality bears that out. So if we think about all the human rights abuses that are going on in the world every single day, so I mean, we can just name different types of human rights abuses and we find them existing all over the world. So for example, extrajudicial killings. So that happens every day in Egypt. Detention camps to round up Muslims. That's every day in China. Withholding of food and medicine from political opponents. That's Venezuela. Imprisonment of journalists. That's Turkey. Ethnic cleansing, possibly even genocide, again, of Muslims, that's going on in Myanmar. And then racial discrimination, police brutality against Black people, that's happening in America. And so when we think about these regimes and these laws and these conventions and these treaties that have existed for decades at this point, we don't have a particularly strong record internationally of abiding by human rights. And so, part of the problem is that, we see these things going on and it's difficult to address all of them at the same time. And there's just far too little that's being done in all of the things that I just mentioned in all these different countries, but the problem is that there's far too little that can be done, right? So not much is being done because there aren't a lot of opportunities to do things, because politics gets in the way, because states have sovereignty. And so we can compare the reactions, for example, or the actions against, for instance, the extrajudicial killings in Egypt, or the concentration camps in China, or the ethnic cleansing of the Rohingya in Myanmar. If we compare the response to those things to, let's say, the human rights abuses in Iraq or in Iran or in Libya, the US came in with planes and with bombs and with drones and special forces and with hellfire, as though those were special or isolated cases and that you don't have human rights abuses elsewhere. And so this is where international law makes me really uncomfortable sometimes, which is to say that the goals are noble and the goals are universal, or should be seen as universal. But where I get really uncomfortable is in this idea that in the name of establishing some universal justice, right, this universal declaration of human rights, or these universal principles against racial discrimination, too often it ends up being the weak states, especially those that are attempting to defy the United States, that are punished, while everybody else gets to act with relative impunity. And so in the name of justice, there's sort of injustice baked into the system, where there is the stronger, or the friendly with the stronger countries that are not held to the same level of account as others when we're talking about these regimes, these conventions, these treaties that are supposed to be upheld universally and applicable universally. And by some definition, I mean, that is injustice, right? Sort of the strong at the expense of the weak. And I know that that's not the intention of the law. Certainly that's not the intention of the law, but in sort of the same way that Rob had mentioned that in the Convention Against Racial Discrimination, there's this idea of, well, the intent is something, but the impact might be something else. So the intent of the law might not be to discriminate, but the impact is discrimination. I think that a lot of these human rights laws, I mean, you have sort of a similar dynamic where the intent is to be universal, but the impact is that it's disproportionate.
I guess this is where we're supposed to smack down. I'm certainly agree that I think there's, if you zoom out and take the large view, there's plenty of evidence if we're just talking about human rights as a subset of international law, there's plenty of evidence from the international human rights realm to support what you're saying. I mean, there's no question about that. But I think a human rights defender wouldn't be content to leave it there. I think a human rights defender, such as myself, would say, well, number one, you're talking about the actions of states, and this is a perennial problem with human rights. I mean, states, we've known for a long time that states are who we look to uphold human rights, but states are also the greatest violators of human rights. Sovereign states are the ultimate hypocrites when it comes to human rights. And there is injustice baked into the anarchical system of sovereign states. So in one sense, what you're saying, I agree with it. It's not shocking. But I think a more important point is that you and I both agree, do we not, that human rights exist, that universal human rights exist and are worth protecting. So I think we should make it clear that we're not dismissing their existence, right? In fact, we've been criticizing the US, for example, for not upholding them or selectively applying them. So it'd be a very weird position if we were to argue that, yes, human rights exist, but the system is so flawed that it's pointless to do anything to uphold them or improve the situation. So to me, I think there's one would be hopelessly naive to deny what you're saying about the injustice baked into the system. But I think the question is more, okay, but you still maintain that human rights exist and they're worth defending and they're worth promoting. So the question now comes into thorny issues about how do you best do that then, I think.
Mm-hmm. Sure, yeah. I think there's no question that we agree that human rights, that there are certain categories of human rights that are no question universal and that they are worth pursuing, and that they should be applicable in all situations to all people living in all places. The question really is just, how can you make that happen? I'm not personally convinced that the existing legal regime is going to become more just in the sense that it'll be enforced in a more universally applicable way. But I think that maybe what we'll do at this point is start talking about strategies, because this is where Rob and I disagree more, right? So we both agree that human rights are worth upholding. We both agree that human rights are violated everywhere in the world, and liberal democracies in the United States are not exempt from human rights violations. And maybe here, I want to sort of give a qualification. When we're talking about the violation of human rights sort of as human rights, we're talking about the violation or abuses that are perpetrated by the state, right? So it's not individual to individual, citizen to citizen, or citizen to non-citizen. It is by the state. And that's what we're primarily focused on. And so to say that this happens in every single country, there is no country that is immune from human rights abuses. And so we can start by thinking about what are maybe some better ways of dealing with human rights, since we both agree that they're important. We both agree that the system as it currently stands is doing a remarkably poor job of handling the caseload of human rights abuses across the world. And so maybe we start with sort of looking at the system itself, looking at the enforcement mechanisms, looking at the legal regimes. And I'll throw it back to Rob here, since he is our international law guy, to talk a little bit about what UN reform might look like, what can sort of be addressed to make the existing system more robust. And I'm going to turn on my light, so I'm going to just get up for 1 second.
Yeah, I think that if you're talking about meaningful reform, meaningful human rights implementation, there has to be UN reform. I think that people just dance around this issue. I mean, there are major human rights treaties, each of which has a specialized committee at the UN that's supposed to be monitoring and tracking and you know, at times enforcing these treaties. People don't submit their reports on time. Nations are late if they submit them at all. A lot of these discussions go on confidentially between the committee and the states. Recommendations are made. There's not a lot of, you know, it sounds silly to say this, but there's not a lot of shaming. I think there should be more shaming of human rights violators by these committees. Shaming is an old tactic, and Amnesty International uses it. Human Rights Watch uses it, and it's pretty effective. But you know, when you do things behind closed doors and things are done in secret, you know, there's not a lot of publicity given. There's not a lot of, you're not shining a light, as Amnesty International would say. There was a question, I think, from Jared and Peggy about the European Court of Human Rights. I have that here in this context. Should I go ahead and talk about that?
Ask me?
Yeah, you think I should?
You don't need my permission. You can go ahead.
Yeah. I mean, is that how we should? Well.
Yeah. Do you want me to read the question? Does that make it easier?
Can you read the question? Because I have a note here.
Yeah. Sure. Yeah. Okay. So, how effective, in your judgment, is the European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg, France, in protecting human rights in Europe and elsewhere?
Yeah. Well, the European Court of Human Rights is actually one of the great success stories in human rights law. And the reason for that is not so much the caseload they have. It's not that every case brought before them, they find everybody guilty. It's that the court is widely seen as legitimate. How do you know? Well, you know because when a judgment is given in Strasbourg, and the government of Slovakia needs to pay reparations to someone, the government of France needs to pay reparations to someone for some violation, the governments comply. The governments comply. It's very rare that it has to go to the European Commission because the government doesn't comply. And when you see widespread compliance like that, that tells you that the court is seen as legitimate by the states that are members of it. And so that's why it's such a success story. Now, you know, there's tension now with Hungary and Poland. And so I'm not sure what's going to happen with that. But generally speaking, I think that's why the European Court of Human Rights is seen as such a success story, is because nations, European nations generally abide by the rulings, and that tells you that it's seen as legitimate. And I might add, actually.
Well, jump in. Hold on. Sorry. Let me just ask a question too. I mean, they see it as legitimate. I mean, that's only part of the story. I mean, such an important element is that they have agreed to relinquish some sovereignty to this court in a way that this cannot be replicable on an international scale. Is that right? Is that a fair characterization?
I don't know, because you could argue that the International Court of Justice, we're getting outside of human rights a little bit, but you could argue, if you're just talking about legitimacy in international law, you could argue that the International Court of Justice, when there are rulings against states, states generally abide by the rulings. I mean, it's not often that it has to be referred to the Security Council because somebody doesn't obey the ICJ. I mean, generally speaking, states abide by ICJ rulings. But
if they don't, then it goes to the UN Security Council.
Yeah, but that's so rare. That's so rare.
I can't even think
of a time when that's even happened. But yeah.
So, but do you think that human rights issues are a lot more sensitive than the types of issues that the ICJ adjudicates? So it's easier to grant legitimacy to the ICJ because they're issues maybe that don't deal with sort of high stakes issues or higher stakes issues. I mean, it's just a question.
I don't know, but I think that some of the things that the ICJ deals with are pretty high stakes issues. I mean, sometimes, it sounds silly, but something like delimitation of the continental shelf seems so boring, but that's a big issue for some countries. The early wave of cases at the ICJ were about the adjustment of colonial claims. I mean, these are high stakes issues. But I know we're getting away from human rights. I take your point, though. I don't think that I didn't mean to say that. Just because the court in Strasbourg is widely seen as successful, it doesn't mean that you're necessarily you can replicate that all over the world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I'm really skeptical that it would be replicated. So would you see it as a contrast to what happens internationally, or do you see it as a model for what can be followed internationally?
I think that the way the court works can be seen as a model, but I think the particular circumstance in which the court arose and the reason why the court has so much legitimacy, because remember, the court, it's in Strasbourg. And so there's this post-World War II reconciliation philosophy underpinning the court, right? It's this city that's right on France and Germany. And there's a spirit of Europe coming together after that. Whereas, there isn't this desire to give up sovereignty to this post-war desire to give up sovereignty to join in a regional organization that underpins other human rights courts in the world. Without that underpinning, I don't see how the legitimacy, it could be as legitimate as Strasbourg court.
Okay, so I'm gonna read now Jared's question because it gets at a similar issue.
Okay.
I'm sorry, also, we said we were not gonna attribute these questions and we just did. Do it again. So
sorry, I just had Jared and we just had the names there.
Okay, so let me read this question to you.
Okay.
Yeah. So how do you judge the future of international human rights bodies, such as the International Criminal Court, right? So we can maybe be specific to that court. Has the Trump administration's fervent condemnation of the ICC given it renewed legitimacy as a norms-making body, or is it doomed to irrelevance without sufficient U.S. buy-in?
Oh, I don't think it's doomed to irrelevance at all. I think that you can see there's the Trump condemnation, which is not a shock to anybody. I mean, he brought John Bolton on board. What do you think they're going to say about the ICC? I mean, they hate it. It's understandable. But the ICC came into existence and has been able to, success, success may be a grandiose word, but it has been able to have some successes. It is stronger than it was before. It has more cases than it has before. It's working better than it has before. All of this is over staunch United States resistance, even active undermining. As the Trump administration has, disparaged the ICC, there's a competing headline, which is that the ICC, for the very first time, has agreed to take up the case of United States war crimes in Afghanistan and Iraq. Before, they would never have done that, but now they finally got enough evidence, and they're able to proceed with this now. I'm a defender of the ICC. I think the ICC needs to be a little more aggressive. But I don't see the ICC as a failure at all. I don't think, to answer the question directly, I don't think the Trump administration's slandering of the ICC is going to have any effect whatsoever to the trajectory of the ICC.
Okay, so moving on then from UN reform and the existing courts and what can be done to strengthen those, we can also talk about moving outside of the framework of those human rights regimes to think about how maybe human rights could be addressed or applied or improved using the more traditional tools that are available to states. And so some of those traditional tools are, for instance, the use of military force. And Rob and I have smacked down multiple times on the question of humanitarian intervention. We could do a really brief one for you because the use of military force is an option when we're talking about dealing with human rights abuses. We could talk about arms sales, right? Mm-hmm. And more specifically, the reduction of arms sales. We can talk about economic sanctions or boycott movements, divestment movements, diplomatic pressure, foreign aid. And then finally, we'll talk a little bit about, maybe you have to do all of this domestically. Maybe the international arena is not really the place that we need to be looking for solutions to human rights problems that exist within states. And so let's start then with, I guess, the highest level, which is military intervention. Rob, is that fine?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. So just really quickly, when we talk about humanitarian intervention, that term is specifically designated for the use of military force, right? So there's humanitarianism, right? And humanitarianism means that a country can use other tools at its disposal to try to address human rights abuses. But humanitarian intervention specifically is reserved for military intervention. And so we have smacked down about this on multiple occasions before. And I think we hold sort of the same positions that we have in the past. And some of you may have seen these smackdowns before. But I mean, I can start and just say I'm really uncomfortable with the use of military force in the name of preserving human rights or upholding human rights or ending the violation of human rights. And I say that for multiple reasons. I mean, first and foremost, I feel very uncomfortable with the idea that a country like the United States, as noble as you know its ideals might be, being the adjudicator of who is committing human rights abuses that are so grave so as to warrant intervention. So what gives the United States and ultimately NATO, because a lot of times it's the United States in conjunction with NATO, what gives the United States and NATO the authority to decide where you're going to drop those bombs, right, and where you're going to send those special forces, and for the reasons that I mentioned earlier, that there's this sort of injustice baked into the system, so that certain countries are always going to be ones that are punished for human rights violations, and other countries are going to continue to act with impunity into perpetuity until you change the way that the system functions to make it more equitable. The second reason why military intervention, humanitarian intervention makes me really uncomfortable is that there's just something that is so counterintuitive about going in with weapons of war in the name of saving people. And when we look at the historical record, the very recent historical record of military interventions in the name of preserving human rights or upholding human rights or ending human rights violations, Libya is a really good example. Iraq is a very good example. And you look at just the chaos and the sheer human terror and agony that has resulted from military interventions that were carried out. I mean, not necessarily exclusively in Iraq's case in the name of human rights violations, but that was certainly part of the rationale. In Libya, it was exclusively the rationale. And I mean, Libya is a failed state. Iraq is almost a failed state. It's sort of recovering, but it took a very long time for it to recover. And so the idea that, I mean, it's this idea of the moral hazard, right? That the intervener, right? So NATO, the intervener is deciding that the consequences of its own actions are more moral or more ethical or more acceptable than the consequences of inaction, right? Even though they're not the ones that are going to experience those consequences. And so you can just go in and drop a bunch of bombs and kill a bunch of people and it's just collateral damage. And then you can kind of walk away from it and say, well, you know, but at least we ended human rights abuses. And so that to me, that's sort of a no-go in almost any circumstance,
Yeah, well, I mean, there's two parts of me. I mean, there's a side of me that says, I agree with you. I mean, having to make lethal action targeted and humane, I think is a pipe dream. I think smart bombs are an oxymoron. I believe that, but I feel like the use of force within the confines of some kind of moral and ethical parameters is unavoidable. If there's a use of force and it's multilateral and it's the last resort, and it's to prevent or stop a human rights violation, not to simply punish a government because they're violating human rights. You're not meting out punishment. It has to be to prevent an egregious imminent human rights violation from occurring. I don't see a way to in certain circumstances as a last resort to use force. Does Iraq qualify as that? No, I don't think it did.
What about Libya?
No, I don't think it did.
So can you give me an example that would qualify?
I think it's hard to think of an example that would qualify. Because the bar has to be really, really high.
So I guess I accept it as a theoretical possibility, that there could be something that is so egregious that there's absolutely no possibility that could be resolved using any other tool, that maybe a multilateral force would be acceptable. But to me, the fact that it is only a theoretical possibility, and it's so hard to imagine such an example from occurring, that I feel pretty good saying that humanitarian intervention is not a tool that I am comfortable with in addressing human rights abuses.
Well, I don't think it's a tool that anyone's comfortable with. And I saw some comments, you are
with.
Well, and I saw some, huh?
It's really funny because we're in the same house and I can like kind of hear your actual voice.
Yeah.
But it is, I'm saying I think I am less comfortable with it than you are. Unless you want to come on my side, that's fine too.
No, I've already conceded enough. But you know, people are talking about Rwanda here on the chat, and I don't know. I don't like to use Rwanda. I feel like Rwanda's hindsight's 20/20 and all that. You don't have the look at Burma, Myanmar right now. You know what's going on. Should you use force to stop massive ethnic cleansing that's going on there? What if the United States were to do that? Mm-hmm. Dina Badie would say, well, this is an unlawful use of force. This is the United States, you know, imposing its will. And Bosco would probably say, yeah, that's probably right. But what if the Association of Southeast Asian Nations were to do it? I know that they don't, you know, but what if there was a regional Asian organization that would do it? You know, would it have more legitimacy if it was multilateral? Force was used. If you were to use force, I don't know. I don't know. You know, somebody's just mentioning Bosnia right now.
Well, how come I'm not seeing the chat for some
reason? I don't know. I'm seeing things pop up.
Okay. I don't see anything.
Bosnia was
go on.
Yeah, well, Bosnia was another example of the risks that Bosnia proves your point. I mean, Bosnia was an example of, to me, Bosnia was an example of, the Bosnian case doesn't help me. Bosnia was an example of the risks that could happen, that, you know, some ethnic cleansing, you know, accelerated after some of the NATO bombing. So I don't know if that's a great, look, I'm not comfortable with it. I'm just saying that I don't think that it's possible. I can't sit here and say that in egregious situations, the international community working with regional organizations, knowing that you have the power to do it, can sit by and just not do anything. I just can't bring myself to argue that.
Mm-hmm. I'm just a little bit distracted by the fact that I'm getting messages that there's nothing in the chat.
Oh, I see things popping up.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh, I feel like you have an advantage then.
Mitchell said Bosnia question mark.
Smackdown.
Dr. Axtell said Rwanda question mark. That's okay, because ultimately I don't think either one of those examples helps my case. But
yeah, I mean, well, I can talk about the
like, I'm not one of those people that says we should have gone in with the Marines into Rwanda. Like, I mean, at this point.
Well, I think actually there's something interesting to be said about the Rwanda case, and again, I mean, it's one of those things where we agree that the level of suffering was so shocking and so fast, and it's not to comment on sort of the impact of the genocide itself, but I mean, there's quite a bit of research in foreign policy at this point about, you know, questioning, you know, should the Clinton administration have acted, or, you know, could they have acted, and what the outcome might have been. And what seems to be sort of the broad consensus, not unanimous, but broad consensus, is that it happened so quickly that by the time that the forces would have been able to mobilize and act in a serious way, that it probably wouldn't have made an appreciable difference ultimately on the genocide. And so again, I mean, could it be sort of taking that as a theoretical possibility that had it been spread out over a longer period of time rather than compacted into sort of this really, really quick so I think it was like 3 months, right? 3 months with almost 1 million Rwandans dying in a really short time frame. But I guess what I'm saying is that there is a theoretical possibility that had it gone a little bit differently, that maybe that would have been a case. But even in that case, the evidence suggests that it would have been extremely difficult to act in a way that would have prevented the majority or the mass of the atrocities because of how quickly it happened.
So for you, there can be no, so are you saying there can be no just or moral use of force? Or are you saying there can be no responsible use of force?
In a human rights violation situation.
In the humanitarian intervention. I'm not talking about the United States is invaded by country X and we have to fight back. I'm not talking about that.
Yeah, again, but that's what I'm saying. Like, it seems like a theoretical possibility as opposed to a realistic possibility. And so I guess what I'm saying is that I feel uncomfortable saying military intervention should be on the table. I feel much more comfortable saying it should be off the table because there are so few cases where I would feel that, in fact, we have exhausted all other possible measures, that, in fact, yes, I mean, military force is the last resort. I think so often military force is sort of seen as the last resort, but it's really like the second resort. Like, you make a public speech. No, that didn't work, so military force, right? Or like we imposed sanctions for a few months, and it's like, oh, we tried that, last resort, military force, right?
Yeah,
like, it's not actually the last resort.
Yeah, I understand that. The TV's on behind you, you know.
Is it? Okay.
Yeah, they're about to see Lion King.
A little bit. You guys are about to watch My Little Pony.
Yeah, but
it's for boring. Okay, so I can move it that way. Okay, so we can move on from military force. I think that we're at this point kind of debating a more minute point, like whether this is like a theoretical possibility or, you know, how many cases this might happen. But we can talk about another example. I mean, I guess another thing that's related to military force is that I think can be effective is the reduction of arms sales. And we had somebody that submitted a question that relates to this, that I'm going to read, about how the U.S. should respond to the humanitarian crisis in Yemen, and what role, if any, should the U.S. play in regime change, particularly in the global south. I mean, just to answer that part quickly, I don't think the U.S. should play a part in regime change. And how do we hold our elected officials and political parties accountable in their ongoing role in human rights abuses? And so, speaking to sort of the U.S. foreign policy change in Yemen, this is a really good example where a reduction in arms sales could make a really big difference. And I mean, the conflict in Yemen is being fought by rebels in Yemen, and those rebels, the Houthi rebels, are, I mean, there's actually not great evidence. It's sort of circumstantial, compelling circumstantial evidence, but mostly circumstantial evidence that they're getting support from Iran. And then the Saudi government is supporting the traditionalist. And there are other factions. I mean, it's not only two sides, it's more complicated than that. But the issue, or a big part of the issue in Yemen, are the aerial bombardments by the Saudi government and by embargoes that they have imposed. And so the problem in Yemen is really, really dire because it's also a country that's extremely poor. And so you have conflict overlaid with poverty, overlaid with famine, overlaid with displacement. And so it's a really, really serious situation. And so much of it is occurring because of the strikes that are being perpetrated by the Saudi regime, and the weapons that the Saudis are using are weapons that are being purchased from the US. And these aren't weapons that were like purchased way back and now they're just coming out of the woodwork and being used in Yemen. I mean, the US has signed some of the largest arms sales to Saudi Arabia during the course of the conflict in Yemen, knowing full well that those weapons could be used in Yemen. And there were some efforts in Congress to sort of reduce that, or like the language that Rob was using, to sort of shine a light on that. But so little has been done because arms sales, it's a lucrative business. And the US wants to be able to sell those weapons. And so Yemen, I think, is a good example of that. But it's not only in Yemen. I mean, the US sells a lot of arms and tear gas and everything else to Egypt, for example. And those are used against peaceful protesters all of the time. And so the issue of arms sales, I think, is a really salient one. And so when we're talking about military and intervention and stuff like that, there's sort of another side to it, which is to say, we may not be participating directly in a conflict, but our weapons are being used. US's weapons are being used in the course of conflicts that are producing these terrible humanitarian tragedies.
I wonder if you had, let's just say theoretically, you had what you would consider a progressive American president, like let's say Elizabeth Warren or Bernie Sanders, right? Something like that, somebody like that. If you had a progressive American president, if a progressive foreign policy would be stronger on that, because they would demand stronger export controls on weapons and, sign the arms trade treaty and, really hold the NRA and Raytheon, whoever it is, I don't know all the big names, but you know what I mean, accountable for this type of thing. I wonder if a progressive foreign policy would actually do better on the arms trade, because so much of it is driven by corporations. Corporations drives the arms trade, right?
Right. I mean, I don't know that we have a good enough historical record of progressives, especially in the presidency, to be able to say that in all likelihood they would do one thing or another. I do know that the Carter administration had campaigned very heavily on the human rights issues and very heavily on the idea of tying arms sales to human rights issues. And once they came in, I mean, they tried to do it, but they weren't consistent. Like with Iran, for example, in the 1970s, this was before the pre-revolutionary Iran in the mid-1970s, the Carter administration sort of talked one way, but ended up just selling just these exorbitant amounts of arms to Iran, despite really severe human rights abuses that were taking place in the country.
Yeah.
And then that's not to say that he was a progressive and that he's like Bernie Sanders or
I understand.
But I think it's easier said than done.
Yeah. Well, Trump, I know that Trump recently, I don't know if unsigned is a word, but basically unsigned the arms trade treaty, and the thing fell through, and the Senate stopped its ratification process of that. Yeah.
Do we want to move on to sanctions?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, economic sanctions. You could take that. It's BDS.
Okay. So I think the idea of economic sanctions is one that we have to parse out a little bit first. So you can have economic sanctions that are bilateral, like state to state. So one state sanctioning another state. You can have multilateral sanctions. So lots of states sanctioning another state. If you really, really want to cause a lot of pain, you need to really have universal sanctions so that all countries, or at least all of the powerful countries, are on the same side sanctioning a state. Otherwise, you can get around the sanctions pretty easily. And so that's one form of sanctions, like state-to-state sanctions. But there are other methods of sort of using economic tools in a punitive way. And so one example is the Bds movement. So the Bds movement that actually is sort of not unified in and of itself, and we don't have to get into all of the details of it. It's something that I've been studying over my sabbatical, but in a nutshell, the idea is that you have civil society as opposed to the state that's the one that's using these economic tools, right? So it's not the government that's imposing sanctions, but rather individuals collectively deciding, well, we are not going to purchase or we are not going to invest in companies that, are, doing whatever it is that is violating human rights, right? And so the big BDS movement now is BDS against Israel, and specifically against companies that operate in the occupied territories in Israel. But you also had that sort of movement against apartheid South Africa. And I've started to hear or read things, and I don't know a lot about this, but I've started to hear and read things about the possibility of using a BDS-like movement to address the systemic racism in the United States. That there may be companies that can be targeted, there may be individuals that could be targeted, that civil society could act domestically in order to try to put pressure on individuals, put pressure on companies. So stay tuned. I don't know what exactly the plan is, but that may be something that may happen in the US.
Mm-hmm.
So
implicitly, the argument is that pressure from civil society, like BDS, may be a more effective way to address human rights violations going on in the occupied territories than, say, the threat of bringing Israeli officials to the ICC.
I mean, I think that there are many tools, right? I mean, I don't think that we need to look at these in isolation of each other. It's not that it should be only BDS or it should be only ICC, it should be only diplomatic pressure, it should be only reduction of arms sales, right? I mean, when we're dealing with problems of human rights that are existing within states that are sovereign, there are a lot of tools at your disposal, and you can kind of finesse them in different ways that depending on the situation.
Now you sound more optimistic than at the beginning, where it was like, well, it's hopelessly unjust, and now it seems like, well, we have multiple tools to use. In combination, we can protect and defend human rights in multiple ways.
Yeah, I'm just not confident that the human rights regime with its enforcement mechanisms can do that. What I'm saying is that it's going to fall to, I mean, in a lot of cases, civil society. I mean, when we get to, and we probably need to move along here, when we get to the idea, for example, of having to deal with things domestically, I think that's far more likely to produce positive results than waiting for something to happen internationally. And I say that, and I guess we can just kind of move on from the question of, well, how can we deal with human rights internationally through, economic sanctions or through military force or through the legal regimes and the international organizations, to say, well, maybe those things are not really effective, and maybe human rights, exactly like Eleanor Roosevelt said, but didn't actually do, but exactly like Eleanor Roosevelt said, that you have to start at home. So who's the you that starts at home? I mean, there's research on protests, right, and particularly nonviolent protests, that they're actually quite effective. Now, are these, for example, in the US, round of protests going to be effective in eliminating and dismantling systemic racism? I hope so. But I also know that that's sort of a luxury that liberal democratic states have that most other authoritarian or all other authoritarian states don't have. I mean, the Arab Spring is a really good example where you had this mass movement of protesters. And even I've had most of you in class, you know how cynical I am about everything. I was actually optimistic, right? For a brief minute, I was really optimistic that this was going to turn the tide, that we were going to see at a minimum an improvement in the human rights situations in these countries that were turning over their governments. I mean, I wasn't particularly optimistic they were going to become liberal democracies, but I thought, something was going to give, something was going to change. And most of you know I'm from Egypt, and so that's the country that I care about deeply personally. And the human rights situation today, after the Arab Spring, is much worse than it was before the Arab Spring. And so it's not to say that domestic protests and uprisings and getting rid of your government from the inside is going to make all of the difference, because it certainly is contextual, and it depends on the situation. But I am hopeful, at least in the case of the United States, because it is a liberal democracy, because there is a necessity of responding to the public, that it could make a difference.
Mm-hmm. Let's move on to diplomatic pressure real quick.
Oh, I thought we were done with the international ones.
Oh, okay. Yeah, sure, we can be.
If you really want to talk about diplomatic pressure, though, you can.
No, I'm fine. Diplomatic pressure is tricky, because actually somebody asked a question about, I think Joe Biden on China.
Hold on, can I, oh, that was good. I thought the chat. Okay. Yeah, so maybe we can go through some of the questions that we haven't addressed that were submitted, and then we can open the chat. Is that good?
Yeah, that's fine with me.
This was relatively organized. We tried to organize. It's just so hard to do it over Zoom because it's a really awkward encounter. Also, he's literally behind the door that's right behind me, and I hear the echo, and I see your smiles, but we can't hear your reaction. So we're trying to keep it as organized as possible. Is everybody good with moving from the discussion to get into questions now? Yes. Okay, that's good enough. Okay, so I think that we've addressed actually a number of them in our discussion in various ways. So let me just see if there are others. Okay, so here's one that's different. So what is your opinion on how the human rights abuses in China will come to affect the upcoming presidential election in the US? And based on the winner of the election, how do you foresee the development of the conversation between China and the US on human rights issues? I'm happy to, you want to go ahead?
Oh, sure. Yeah, that's fine. Well, if Biden wins, I think he's going to be in a very tricky position, because everything that I've heard, I mean, this is what I was saying when the diplomatic pressure is tricky, because everything I've heard, I don't have Twitter, but everything I've heard Biden saying about China, if you just want to use China, real hard line on Chinese human rights violations, be it cracking down on protesters in Hong Kong, or be it what's happening with the Uyghur situation in Xinjiang. He's real hard line on that. But that's tricky, because then you take a hard line on that, and human rights defenders are happy, but you may impact cooperation in other areas. So it's a very risky strategy. So it'll be very interesting to see. And the progressive wing of the Democrats, the progressive wing is very confrontational with China on human rights issues. Human rights issues in general, very confrontational. But there's a cost to that. So it'll be very interesting. I mean, we don't know, but it'll be very interesting to see how that shakes out. He's even taught, there's something called the Global Magnitsky Act, where you could start sanctioning Chinese officials or sanctioning companies that may do business with companies related to the Uyghur situation or the Hong Kong situation. Biden would probably want to enact that. So it'll be interesting to see what a harder line what'll happen with a harder line.
I think one other interesting thing to say about the US and China is that, I mean, China obviously has already begun to finger point and say, wait a minute, right? You're talking about our human rights abuses. How about your human rights abuses? We don't mistreat our Black population. Of course, they're severely mistreating their Muslim population and other populations. But it is going to be really interesting to see sort of who wins in that battle of hearts and minds. And I think it's going to be really difficult for the United States, at least in the short term, and depending what happens, whether this just fizzles out, or whether, becomes a sustained movement with a lot of momentum. But I think that the US is going to be in a really, really challenging position to keep asserting itself as a leader on human rights, so long as you have protests, and you have this attention, right, this publicity on the human rights abuses in the United States. Yeah. Regardless of who wins the election, I think. So we have another question here. Do you believe that defunding the police and abolishing the police are one and the same? If not, do you support one over the other? I can take that question. So, I don't study the police, but what I can say is that my understanding is that defunding the police is sort of the umbrella, and abolishing the police is one possibility under that umbrella. And so you could defund the police by taking away some of the funds, but preserving sort of some skeletal version of the police, and then redirecting resources to other venues and social programs, and other methods of public safety. Or you abolish the police entirely and then redirect all of those resources. And so my understanding is that, they're not exactly the same, but you may have people with different interpretations of what it means to defund the police. So one person saying defund, so Rob might be saying defund the police and meaning abolish it, and I might be saying defund the police and I'm saying don't abolish it, but redirect, some amount of resources in another direction. So that sort of answers the first part of the question. The second part is, do you support one over the other? I think it's really hard to say, again, because I don't study this. And so coming at it as a novice, right, just learning about these ideas in the American context, is difficult to answer. What I can say that I find really interesting is that this idea of defunding the police has spread outside of the United States. And so this idea of solidarity with George Floyd has happened not only from the perspective of protests all over the world that are condemning the actions of American police, and condemning the systemic racism in the United States, but also there's been solidarity between the movement in the United States and sort of independent movements outside of the United States that are fighting their own battles with the police, they're fighting their own battles with human rights. And I've started to see this idea of defunding the police sort of entering the rhetoric in other places as well. And so I think it depends a lot on situations. The other thing is that, defunding the police, that in the US, the police is not a national police force, right? It's municipal, it's sort of these localities. And so maybe in one instance, completely abolishing makes sense. In another instance, defunding makes sense, right? Defunding in the sense of not abolishing. So yeah, I'm not answering your question directly, but that's the best I can do on that one. And so I think that gets us through all of the questions. So if there are others in the chat, I think that Megan Milby is going to help us work our way through those. Am I right?
Yeah, thanks, Dina. I'm going to keep my video off so it doesn't flip over to me. But while I'm waiting for other guests to submit questions, before Rick had to scoot off, he had a question. Your views in both cases, which you were talking about earlier, presuppose the continued importance of states and borders in human rights promotion enforcement. Does the increasingly globalized world in which we live suggest that states are no longer the key to guaranteeing human rights? Bodies that exist above the state seem to be disempowering the state, and cross-border movements below the state are shaming states and spotlighting abuses. What does that suggest about the need for new international regimes?
you want to take this, Rob, or do you want me to?
I'm not.
Of course, Rick had to be in here and ruin everything for us, right?
And then scoot off.
And then he went off to another meeting. Yeah.
No, it's such a good question.
Yeah, I'm not. Sorry, Dina, go ahead.
I was gonna say I really am not entirely convinced that states are rendered irrelevant yet, or even that states are significantly weakened so as to not be at this stage the most important force when we're dealing with human rights, particularly because when we're talking about these human rights regimes, the types of human rights abuses that we're dealing with are perpetrated by the state. And so there has to be changes at the state level, even if that pressure might come from other sources. So for example, globalization and major multinational companies and so on, they may start putting pressure on governments to act differently. That's possible. But I don't know that globalization is sort of this new phenomenon. It's been going on at least since the 90s as a force that was supposed to undermine the state in significant ways. And I just don't think that the state has been undermined to the level where we can kind of ignore it and move on to other entities as being best suited to deal with human rights.
I think that that's something else that we can agree on. I too see kind of a renaissance of great power politics, and it's scary. But no, I think that I too don't see bottom up or top down erosion of state power. I see a renaissance of state power. I'm not, like I said before, I consider myself someone who is a human rights defender, but I'm not sunny about the prospects. I agree that it's a great power politics era.
Okay. This question is about the new George Floyd Scholarship. Did anyone suggest naming it the Breonna Taylor Scholarship Fund? She being from Kentucky, I would think that would have been more appropriate.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So the idea of naming it the George, so first of all, it's not a scholarship fund. It's a fund that is going to be housed in the Office of Diversity and Inclusion in order to distribute grants to existing students, faculty, and staff with the idea of trying to start dismantling some of the cultures and the systems at Centre College that are problematic. And so by having a grant program that's housed in the diversity office, the idea is that we are trying to turn the page and we're trying to do the anti-racist work that has to be done at Centre College, and allowing students, faculty, and staff to be sort of creative and imaginative in what that needs to look like. And so the reason that we decided to name it the George Floyd Cornerstone Fund, and so Cornerstone is really central here. The George Floyd Cornerstone Fund is because George Floyd was eulogized by the Reverend Al Sharpton at his funeral as the cornerstone of a movement, and saying essentially that his death, as tragic as it is, has become this cornerstone to sort of turn the page and to make the changes that are necessary to combat systemic racism. And so the reason we named it that was precisely because this idea of the cornerstone, that we can use his death, right? Not use, but turn the tragedy of his death into an opportunity to remake Centre in the same way that the country can transform his death into something that remakes the country. And so I recognize that we have somebody that's a little bit closer to home in Kentucky, and we had discussions about that. But I would like to say that the plan is that the George Floyd Cornerstone Fund is not going to be the last thing that we do. And we hope to have some kind of fund or some kind of scholarship or something at Centre College in memory of Breonna Taylor.
Okay. Rob, did you want to add anything?
No, Dina was intimately involved in the development of that entire initiative, so she was the appropriate person to answer that.
Great. Okay, what do you see as the future of contracted police trainings by U.S. police forces in developing countries, considering the widespread coverage of law enforcement abuse in the U.S.?
What do we see as the future of police training?
Yeah, sort of like the contacts.
Mm-hmm.
Can this person sort of follow up? Is the question about sort of the training of police abroad by American police, given what's happening? Is that what we're referring to?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. That's a good question. I mean, I don't know. I don't claim to know. I would venture to guess, take an educated guess, that it would probably make a difference in some countries over others. I think that American diplomacy with African countries is going to become more difficult, and China is already trying really hard to exploit that. And so it's probably going to depend. I think for some countries it's going to matter more than others. I also think that for some countries, I mean, as unfortunate and horrifying as this sounds, for some countries, I mean, the tactics that the United States uses are precisely what they want. I mean, they're authoritarian states that are looking to oppress political dissidents. So I don't know. I don't know. I think it could go in a lot of different directions.
I will say though, this isn't, I don't know if this will affect training, but just by the way, just as someone that tries to keep up on the literature and what's coming out in international law and human rights law, I think, I think in global civil society and in the human rights community, and hopefully in diplomatic communities, there is a growing awareness that police issues are human rights issues. And that was always kind of there. And there were always kind of reports about this around in the 90s, but this is definitely coming into focus, that police issues are being seen as human rights issues more and more. And so I think with global civil society, that's an important development.
Okay. With the recent weakening of the EU via Brexit and arguable weakening of the US as an international enforcer by virtue of protests and general loss of international respect over the last few years, should we expect the UN to undergo any type of change?
Expect? I don't think so. Should it? I guess this is sort of what you were getting at, Rob, earlier.
Yeah, I mean, but the United States, great powers like the United States have no incentive to want to change the UN. The European Union is not going to waste its diplomatic capital pressuring the UN to fundamentally change how it operates. I think that seems to be what the question. If UN reform is ever going to happen, I don't think it's going to be because of US pressure or you would have to have US buy-in and EU buy-in, but I don't think the EU or the US, either one of them, you know, they both benefit from the current structure of the UN.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Dr. Badie, Yemen is facing one of the worst refugee crises of our time, and it is caused primarily by Saudi ideologues. Is that right? Am I saying that right? Yeah. What is the solution for state-imposed refugee crisis when we cannot rely on militaristic force, the UNHCR, or any other available multilateral global resources?
So a couple things. So I guess that I would separate the UNHCR from the other pieces of the human rights regime, because the UNHCR is sort of guiding the Refugee Convention, and that gives states certain obligations as to what they can and cannot do if a refugee enters into your borders. And so what is it called? Non-refoulement? Is that what it is, Rob? Non-refoulement. Yeah. So the principle of non-refoulement that is in the Refugee Convention that states are obligated to follow would say that if a refugee enters into, your borders, then you cannot return them back to the state that they come from because they are a refugee. And so I guess that I would separate that out and say that is something that is more easily enforceable than something like the UNDHR or like the Convention on Racial Discrimination that we talked about before, that are sort of laying out the principles for the way that states should behave with respect to their citizens. Because we're talking about a certain class of individuals that are fleeing from their country. And so, a lot of the question, sometimes the question resides on whether a country recognizes individuals as refugees or not as refugees. And a lot of times that can be contentious, but I think that in general, the refugees that are leaving Yemen are considered refugees. Part of the issue is that Saudi Arabia, if I'm correct, I'm almost certain that Saudi Arabia is not a party to the Refugee Convention. And so anybody trying to move into Saudi Arabia, right, because they share a border, they may or may not be able to resettle. If they are able to resettle or allowed to resettle, they wouldn't be counted as refugees because Saudi Arabia is not a party to that convention. And so I guess my answer to that question is that I think that there is more promise for dealing with refugees than there is for human rights as sort of a more general, universalized principle.
All right. I have two more questions, and I think since we're pushing on 90 minutes, we probably want to, well, I'm not sure we want to end on the last question, but I'll let you guys decide.
Okay.
So the first one is a follow-up to the UN question from the same person. Could we see any other UN member states step up into a more prominent role, or is that equally as unlikely as UN reform?
A more prominent role, what does that mean? Like, I'm not sure what that means.
Is it a more prominent role in the UN or just internationally?
Within the UN.
Given this, I'll try to answer this, but given the structure of the United Nations, the most prominent roles at the UN are the 5 Security Council members. And so the likelihood of somebody stepping in to either displace one of them or to become a 6th Security Council member is zero, right? Or almost approaching zero.
Yeah.
Sorry, say again?
That would constitute Security Council reform.
Right.
None of the Security Council members have any incentive to want.
Right. I guess the one thing that I might add is that in the 1950s and 60s into the 70s, right? So during sort of the middle of the Cold War, the non-aligned movement formed. And it wasn't sort of a country that rose up to be really powerful to challenge the United States or the Soviet Union. It was a block of countries that said, we are going to vote in concert as a coalition to combat the pressure of the United States and the Soviet Union. And so maybe you might see something like that, but I think it would be really difficult for a single country to emerge as a strong power within the United States outside of the P5, unless maybe some coalition formed. What do you think, Rob?
Yeah, I
okay.
kind of said what I had to
I
say.
think you agreed with me on everything today. Huh? It wasn't much of a smackdown. It was like a Dina Rob love fest today.
Every day is a Dina Rob love fest.
All right. All right, Megan. I'm a little afraid because you said maybe we don't want to end on the last questions. I'm a little afraid for what this is going to be.
I don't know what the heck this is going to be.
It's just an open-ended question. So
the worst. Okay.
So thoughts on Trump's commentary regarding the World Health Organization and COVID-19?
Mm-hmm. But by commentary, I'm not sure which commentary. I mean, there's been a lot of press conferences, and I have to be honest, after the first couple of weeks, I just didn't watch any more press coverage.
Well, it's
and
pretty
so I don't know if there's a specific commentary. If the reference is to sort of threats against the World Health Organization, just the general commentary of using racist slurs in referring to COVID-19.
It's actually, Dina, real quick, a follow-up based on funding, the freeze on the funding, and termination of the relationship specific.
With the World Health Organization?
Right.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Dina, you know the WHO much better than I do. You could take that one if you want.
I mean, I guess a commentary on it's part of a broader pattern with this administration where anything that sort of rubs him the wrong way, he wants to withdraw from. It would be really a tragedy, I think, if the United States really truly abandoned the World Health Organization, especially in the middle of a global pandemic. And so I guess that's the best I can give in terms of a commentary. Because this is precisely, did the WHO make mistakes? Absolutely, the WHO made mistakes. But this is sort of an unprecedented global pandemic, and they need resources, and they need to be able to act, especially in countries that don't have their own resources in combating the pandemic. And so, yeah, I mean, I guess that's my commentary.
Okay. We do have one to end on. Thank you,
Okay.
Jared. I'm giving him away.
Okay.
Given that the viewership here is primarily young alumni, what can we do to best support the IST program and current IST students?
So I want to say that, we're so appreciative that you all are here.
Real quickly, Dina, at this point, you guys.
I hope that if you all are, in your pajamas and you don't want to put on your screens, that's totally fine. But we would love to see as many faces as we can just to say goodbye at the end. But we're so appreciative that all of you are here, and we want you to know that we have already talked about this, and we're going to reserve the funds that have been raised in order for us to be able to get pizza and do Badie-Bosco Smackdowns at center for the current students, because we have no budget now, right? So there is no Division II budget, there is no IST budget. So thank you, POTUS. Yeah, I really appreciate that. So I see all of your faces at the same time. I have it on that view. Anyway, but so I don't have any specific ideas for you at this time, but our plan is to keep engaging with all of you, and our plan is to keep having these important conversations with you. We miss all of you. I told all of you when you graduate to please stay in touch, and almost none of you have stayed in touch. But we're gonna stay in touch with you, whether you like it or not. Yeah. And so I don't know. I mean, we hope to do more events like this, and we want to be engaged with all of you. And we think that talking about global issues, contemporary issues, is a great way to do that, because I know you've all moved on from Center College, but I trust that you have a place in your heart for IST.
We're also changing our curriculum.
You also what?
We're also changing our curriculum.
Great. Well, we cannot thank you enough. I'm not sure, I don't see Mackenzie on the screen right now, but we cannot thank you enough. Oh, there she is. We've been hiding. We can't thank you enough for doing this tonight, and for all of you out there joining us. It was so much fun, and really loved it. And I do feel like, I don't know, I mean, I need to see some shaking heads here from the alumni. I maybe have gotten a little cheated on this Smackdown, because it really did feel like a Dina Rob love fest versus like smacking down. But it was really, really fun and so educational for me, especially. please keep in touch with us and let us know what more virtual programming you want to see. Obviously, this was a really good one for us to start with, and we'd love to keep offering some inspirational programming as we all navigate COVID-19 and our virtual events. So with that, I'm going to thank you and let everyone wave at the camera as we're recording, and have a great night.
Thank you,
And thank
everybody.
you, Mackenzie, again for organizing
Thank you for organizing this. It was a lot of fun.